Good evening. When it's Tuesday, you know it's the Raw Leadership Talk. Coming to you live from Mombasa today, featuring Dr. Jason Musyoka from Durban, South Africa today. All of us, we are a different destination, and we are glad to connect with you. Thank you very much, and welcome to the Raw Leadership Talk. As we listen to Handel, Messiah of Order Music, get ready for a powerful discussion today. Where are you watching us from? We'll be glad to hear from that in a minute before we begin our show. Where are you watching us from? Kindly let us know. Today our discussion is on Africa economic recovery post-COVID-19. And I'm sure all of us, for one reason or another, we have been affected with the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses have been closed, nations are struggling, employment rate is coming low. Whether you are in Kenya or you're in other parts of Africa, I'm sure you can feel the pain of this pandemic. So today we want to discuss this. Is there a way out? Are there methodologies that we can use to recover? Join in this particular discussion today. Thank you very much, Livingston Macquarie, for joining in, and all the rest who have joined it today for this wonderful, wonderful discussion. Dr. Jackson, how are you?
Thank you so much, Dan. I am doing very well. Thank you so much. And greetings from Durban, South Africa.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. We have really been anticipating this particular discussion, and we are glad that you could make it to be with us here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am looking forward.
Thank you. What would you say is the state of the African economy, or was the state of the African economy pre-COVID-19 and currently?
Right. So a quick review of the African economy, pretty much from around the early 2000s, running all the way to just about 2019. There was a lot of rhetoric within the economic debates about the booming Africa, Africa rising, African narrative, rising Africa. So we've had these sorts of terms that have been used as labels to describe how the African economies were performing. And rightly so, because statistically speaking, Sub-Saharan Africa was 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, pretty much for the last 2 decades, were located here in Africa. So we were doing pretty well compared to the rest of the world. And the debate was going towards a conclusion that this was really an African moment. And in the same way that we saw the rise of Europe post-World War II, it was suggested that we were really finally making a break to a development progress that was going to begin picking pace. So there was a pretty good performance. Countries such as Ghana, their economic growth projections. South Africa and some of the South Africa, Nigeria, Angola, unfortunately, they were not performing very well for both domestic and global forces. In South Africa, we had 10 very bad years, I would say, but at the same time, recurring droughts that really decimated the agricultural sector to a large extent. But also, importantly, most of the middle income countries, such as Nigeria and South Africa, they got into a situation economically, we call it a middle income trap, where there is low growth rate and there's very slow growth, and there's not much momentum happening. And these are economies that grow sub 3%. So economies that are such as South Africa and Nigeria and Angola were growing really slow, for domestic reasons, but also secondly for reaching what economists refer to as a middle income trap. Those economies were not doing very well, unlike economies such as Kenya that was growing just about 5%, and Ghana 7%, Ethiopia as well. Those economies were growing really fast.
Thank you, thank you. I think that's a very good introduction as far as the African economy pre-COVID-19 and currently how the state is. But how have we managed? How would you say we have managed the situations? And are there countries in Africa which have cautioned themselves very well than others as far as this COVID pandemic is concerned?
That's an interesting question, Dan, and a very critical one. If you look at the interventions of states, now globally, there are two major responses that governments across the world, whether you're talking of Italy or France or European countries, North American countries or African countries, they adopted. The first was a series of lockdowns, which countries initiated to try and minimize transition or movement of the population, given the nature of the spread of the pandemic. Given that coronavirus is known to spread rapidly among people who are traveling. So airports closed and ports of entry closed, immigration borders closed. Even in countries such as South Africa, inter-provincial borders crossed. And I know that in Kenya, that's also been the case, where county borders closed, so you could not travel to other counties. So that was one drastic measure that governments employed to try and contain the spread of the pandemic. But that was for countries that were smarter, if I may use that term, to bundle the lockdowns with humanitarian assistance and economic recovery. Countries went ahead and provided a huge stimulus package back to the economy. There was massive injection of the economy. We've seen Germany do that. China has done that. US has done that. UK. And there has been South Africa as well, a huge stimulus package that was developed for the purposes of cushioning the companies and citizens or households that were falling into poverty trap during that time. So countries that initiated stimulus packages, they went a step further than just those who did lockdown only. But beyond the stimulus package, there was, or if you look at the breakdowns of most of the stimulus packages, they were split roughly into two major categories. The one category, as I've indicated, was to boost businesses, but very importantly, the second category was to provide some form of social grants for households. So if you're not, you become unemployed during the pandemic, you could be able, for example, to access some form of relief in form of cash, whether from the state or largely from the state. So that measure, that mechanism, that responsive mechanism, for me, if you look at the successful countries such as Singapore and others, they were pretty successful in binding or combining or bundling both those two responses. Unfortunately, in the continent, we've had very few countries that provided stimulus package. So there were lockdowns, which was the first step, but there was not much of a stimulus package that we saw to cushion businesses and also households that were falling into poverty. The problem with not cushioning them is that you're going to increase or to see significant increase of the number of businesses that fold, and that automatically results to high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, which the government still has to start dealing with in the long run. So that's a mistake that I think a lot of African countries did not do, not least because most of them were already in huge debts. Kenya is a case in point, by the way, highly indebted by the time we were getting into the pandemic because we had borrowed for infrastructure development. Countries like Zambia as well, countries like Sudan. Sudan has just been forgiven 500 that did not know really how to cope. And so that's it's a failure. A lot of countries did not respond adequately as they should, certainly in the African continent.
I get you, and I think that's very good information for us to know going forward, because then what lessons can African countries adopt from the challenges caused by this pandemic? Because we didn't seem prepared, and even as we go through it, very few of the African countries have seemed to adopt to the challenges of this pandemic. So what lessons then can African countries adopt from the challenges caused by this pandemic?
So I think one of the developing countries everywhere, including African countries, they do face these sorts of challenges of cash flow, fiscus not having enough money to stimulate development. And that is given because you have to spend a lot of money for you to be able to re-inject in the economy. But I want to go back to 100 years ago, between 1918 and 1922. There was a very similar pandemic to what we have now, which was at the time known as a Spanish flu. And that was at the tail end of the First World War. So the spreading of it, because of movement of soldiers from one country to another, there was significant spread of the pandemic. And it was a spread exactly like COVID-19. Countries went to their knees. I know South Africa was hugely affected by the Spanish flu, for example, and most of the other countries that were involved in the First World War. And a decade after that, there was the Great Depression. And with that, again, countries went to their knees. There was significant devastation of economies around the world. I'd like to suggest that if you look at almost 100 years on after that, we've had a reverse of that. On one side, we had our recession that happened in 2008. And then we had the pandemic happening in 2019. So we've really had a typical reverse of what happened between 1922 and 1930, the populations around then. Now, the responses that governments gave to such pandemics, by the time the Great Depression was kicking in 1929, there was a significant stimulus package that was given out to governments to try and get back on course. But that was the birth of what economists call the Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was a sort of economic approach that suggested that governments need to take drastic actions to incentivize the economy, but also to intervene, to do massive spending, to spend huge amount of money to stimulate the economy. So that's a concept that has been very much debated within governments and economies all over the world, especially fast forwarding to the 1980s, where it was suggested governments need to withdraw and just allow citizens to be able to make their own choices. So the 1930s interventions were significantly successful. Fast forward again to after World War II, with the US providing the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a massive stimulus package that the US provided to Europe to build their infrastructure after devastation by the World War II. And what we saw again post-World War II was a massive stimulus injection of money into the economy. And that's how Europe really developed after World War II. So to respond to you directly, if we have anything to learn from the 1920s, the 1930s, and 1950s after World War II, it is for governments to take drastic actions to provide significant assistance to businesses and households. And the way to do that is to ensure massive spending. That's very critical. But when governments are trapped into just the political surface and not looking at the developmental consequences that the pandemic is going to cause, that is going to have a lasting impact on creating even more poverty traps in the continent than we already have. It might be well that we will spend probably another 10 years trying to dig ourselves out of the hole that we are in. But this is dependent on how governments are going to respond.
But do you think, Jason, following on your response, do you think African governments are conscious about providing stimulus, especially for business? Because we seem to borrow for developmental projects, and sometimes I feel they are not the priority, especially when we are trapped within a pandemic. Do you think most African governments are conscious towards investing towards businesses and production so that the economy can be sustained?
So there are two responses to that question, Dan. The one is that some countries that were doing well even before the pandemic, it was a very deliberate process. If you look at Ghana,
Mhm.
their investments and governance, good governance systems putting in place. Rwanda is another example with very clear vision of where they want to go and what they want to do. Ethiopia, the same thing. Botswana spent the last decade sorting out their governance and development as well. The countries that have posted significant economic growth numbers were countries that did not just muddle along, hoping that somehow the economies will recover or develop. They were very deliberate, and they borrowed from a system that we saw in East Asia in the 1990s, between up to 1998, the so-called East Asian tigers, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, which were reasonably authoritarian at the time, but they delivered or they posted significant development. That's how they really escaped poverty, those countries, because they had a very clear vision on where they wanted to go. Now, more to the point of the question you're asking, whether African governments are determined to, or there's a clear vision beyond the pandemic. And unfortunately, if you look at countries like Chad and even Kenya now at the moment, what we see is a sort of a political circle that unfortunately we do not seem really prepared to respond to the future. Now, the fact that we had borrowed, or Kenya had borrowed so much money, and there are several other countries, Zambia is an example, and Zimbabwe is on its knees as well, and several other African countries, Uganda as well. These countries, they had borrowed heavily for infrastructure development. And that's always a bad idea because and then the pandemic arrived. So this is
Yeah.
like you spending or squandering your money on a household level. You have no money left even for food. And then there is a devastating storm that knocks. That's exactly what happened. To recover from that is very difficult. And again, it's not impossible, but you have to have a clear strategy and vision. So if you continue the tradition of political, or we call it the absence of what we call substantial elections or substantial democracy, it's where between the 5-year cycle, between the
Yeah.
time that we elected the previous leadership and the next, that is a time to put your shoulder on the wheel. You do everything you can to recover. Now, if you are caught in a permanent state of election politics, unfortunately, like most of the countries are, then it is going to be extremely difficult. So, in summary, there is not very clear vision from most of the countries on how to recover. Countries like South Africa, they have even developed a strategy after the pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic, a
Okay.
national strategy of a response. We haven't seen that in most countries. So I hope that that's going to happen. And if there isn't, unfortunately, we are not going to get out of poverty by accident. It has to be a deliberate, strategic vision by the political leadership.
I hear you. We are not going to get out of poverty by accident. Daniel Musibi says, great to listen in, and thanks, Doctor, for great insights. Cosmas Owili says he has never seen any stimulus package, only tax exemption for a short time, followed by inflation. And Edna Leku says, following at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we are very glad to have Dr. Jason Musyoka all the way from Durban in South Africa, talking to us about African economic recovery post-COVID-19. Back to you, Dr. Jason. Any recommendation for recovery post-COVID-19 which you could make as an expert for African countries?
So I think the one is that in governments, given where we come from, and if you look again, I like always locating issues from an historical reference point. If you see where we've come from, especially 1980s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, which in Africa they are referred to as the lost decades. Most of the African countries were growing at negative during those 3 decades. And one of the ways in which we dug ourselves out of that was to have a very persistent pressure groups from NGOs, from businesses themselves. They added their voice and they put pressure on governments and including opposition parties. And across the board, if you look at the 1990s, which is when the period that is referred to as the second coming of democracy, which is when multi-party democracy was introduced in Africa, that was a consequence of a lot of action by unions and pressure groups and NGOs. The civil society was very active. So I'd like to suggest that the civil society should not stand on the wayside, hoping that government should do the right thing. I think we need to see the same pressure groups, the same civil society that was so vocal in the liberation of the continent, raising their voices and putting pressure on governments to do the right thing. Without those pressure groups, we are going to see shrinking economic spaces and shrinking democratic spaces. And I think that is not what that would be as a major blow to what we've been experiencing in the last 2 decades of Africa rising. The narrative is likely to change if we are not very careful. We might go back to where we were coming from in the 1980s and 90s.
Thank you very much. But is there any good example of an African country that currently we would say that is staying afloat, irrespective of the pandemic, that could be a very good strategic example to other African countries to borrow from going into the future?
Botswana is a very good example. I always, it's an admirable country, Botswana, because according to the United Nations Development Program and the World Bank, Botswana was ranked among the most poor 44 countries in the world. And by the way, out of the worst or the worst performing countries, economically speaking, in terms of poverty index, 33 of them are from sub-Saharan Africa. That is a worrying data. But Botswana is the only country in that list of 44 that has been able to get out of that highly indebted countries and poor countries to a middle income economy in a short period of time. So that is one. Botswana is a very good example. And the way they've done is they were able to diversify. They firstly did an audit of their own economy. And they found out that if we continue, they were relying largely on diamonds. If we continue relying on minerals, we are going to sink. So they then decided to start diversifying their economy, and it's really borne fruit. South Africa is also faring reasonably well. There is quite a level of corruption, and I think you see that in the media and during the COVID. But policy-wise, I think the country has done pretty well. There was a stimulus package, and there was humanitarian relief. Businesses have been given tax breaks. There was a point where you could either decide to pay for there was a relief for mortgage, people who owned property and cars. You were exempt from paying for 3 months, and that gave you a window to try and recover. So policy-wise, South Africa has done reasonably well, and I think that might be an example to follow. But the question is always on the long haul beyond just the policy responses. The governance system, I come back to that point. That's a very, very critical issue that we need to address, the issue of governance. And then lastly, Rwanda is another good example. They've continued their vision, even through the economic vision, even through the pandemic. We've seen how they managed the pandemic, and the economic recovery continues. And I think that's, so Botswana, Rwanda, South Africa, those are good examples that we could follow.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So you have out there our viewers that Botswana, Rwanda, who is just our neighbor right here in Eastern Africa, and South Africa, good example of how they have managed the pandemic irrespective of the challenges that be. You have seen, you as a Kenyan who lives in South Africa, you have seen how we have a double standard, let me say that, double standard in the way we approach the whole issue of COVID-19, pandemic, and the economy at the same time. Our ability to balance between politics and economy, it's been really, really difficult. I don't know, what kind of recommendation would you give for a country such as ours here in Kenya?
I think that, and I've obviously, because of my family and my ties, it's my home, so I follow very closely what's going on in Kenya. And one of the things I'd really like to see is the point I mentioned earlier, the civil society taking serious action against the government, or putting a lot of pressure on government to deliver on their mandate, the big fives and all of what the Vision 2030 was about. The vanguard, the watchdog, is the civil society. They must hold the government to account. But I think, secondly, unfortunately, I've seen that the citizens themselves, because of the way politics have evolved in Kenya, it's become politics have become intoxicating to the point that citizens have equally become party to what the government is saying. I see, for example, the debate about the BBI initiative and the court judgment about that. This is not the time to discuss about BBI. People have slid into poverty, significant numbers. Unemployment has shot up to 40%, more than that. It's not the time to discuss about trivial things, in my perspective, when there are livelihoods at stake. Any government's legitimacy must be held into account, and it must be measured by the extent in which it delivers livelihoods to people and basic services. If a government cannot deliver services, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about building bridges or you're talking about Vision 2030, but if you can't build your roads, you can't collect refuse, you can't supply water, you can't provide electricity, sanitation, the very basic services that historians and philosophers, they established in the old Greek system, the Roman system. Governments were established first and foremost to provide basic services. If a government fails to provide that, it has no legitimacy whatsoever. And that's what we need to hold our governments to account. Unfortunately, we haven't done that. And beyond that, there's also what has now come to be known as a developmental stage, which is you go beyond the basic services to ensuring that your vision is very clearly to impact on people's lives, improve their livelihoods, build opportunities for businesses, create conducive investment opportunities. And all of that governments do as developmental states because they do want to make an impact in the lives of people. But the moment that we are trapped in politics and the so-called BBI, unfortunately, our priorities are very, very misplaced.
Thank you very much. Powerful recommendation right there. What will be your closing remarks as we bring this show to a close, Dr. Jason?
I think what I would suggest is that there was very quickly, there was a case of a Greek, a Roman emperor, and he used to always be very fierce and powerful. And he got to a point where his handlers were so afraid of him. And the one day they saw him without clothes, but nobody wanted to tell him that he doesn't have clothes because he was so powerful. And they went and figured out a best way of communicating to him. And they said to him, "Emperor, you are very well dressed, except that your dress code is see-through. It's transparent." And the point, but the oppositions and everybody else went out into the streets, and the argument was that, "Emperor, you have no clothes." That's what we have to say to our governments. You have no clothes. You have nothing left. You are uncovered. And that is a point we should not shy away from putting pressure on the people that we've elected to govern us, to govern our affairs, and to improve our livelihoods.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard it right there from Dr. Jason Musyoka, African Economic Recovery Post-COVID-19. What a wonderful discussion we have had today on the Raw Leadership Talk. And I want to believe every leader that has been following this talk, and you want to watch this talk later, these are wonderful tips to expose us and give us information even on the way forward. On our part, we have a work to do as leaders to put pressure on the government to do the right thing, to deliver on their mandate. And if you have that position already, that you are supposed to deliver on the mandate, please do so for the benefit of the citizen, for the benefit of the nation. We have to stop there today. Until next week, same time, same place, bringing to you the Raw Leadership Talk from the Africa Center for Public Speaking. Thank you very much. God bless you, and good night.